Minister, Chairperson of the RSC, ladies and gentlemen, friends, colleagues, it's a real pleasure to be here, and thank you, Patrick, for introducing me. I've been with the Water Integrity Network for the past 2.5 months, but I've been in the water sector a lot longer than that. Patrick's been around for long enough to lose his hair. I've been around long enough to keep my hair, but go very grey in the process. So I'm delighted to be here. I'm delighted to be here to be able to represent WIN, which, as Patrick has said, the IRC and WIN are very close partners. We could strengthen the partnership in many ways, but it's an important relationship. And so I'm very glad to be here and to be able to take part in the next 3 days of discussion. I'm going to talk essentially about 3 points. I want to talk a little bit about systems and some of my experience and thinking around systems. I want to talk a little bit about transformational change in systems, and then I want to talk about what I've called the shadow system, which is the whole issue of corruption and lack of integrity. So I think the first thing for me is that when one's talking about systems, or talking about the system, the reality is that there isn't one system. And I think Patrick has already set the scene for this in many ways. There are a lot of different systems that interact. And I think when one talks about systems thinking in the wash sector, it's interesting that a lot of people see it very differently. I came across a comment from the head of Southern Waters in the UK about how important it was to embrace systems thinking in the wash sector. And what he was seeing as systems thinking was that he needed to think beyond the boundary on the map of his physical system. So to see the connections, presumably to the water resources system, and perhaps even to other water services systems nearby. But systems thinking is so much more than that, because there are so many different layers and different types of system that interact. So there's a physical system. And for some people, that's been the water or sanitation system historically. There's the pipes, there's the physical infrastructure and how that all works. But there are the institutional systems that Patrick referred to. And the institutional systems on their own are extremely complex as a system. There are the system of the political economy, which is critical in what services are delivered and how and where and to whom. There's social systems. Each of these is complex in their own right, and each of these interact in different ways in a particular context. And so I think one of the things for me that is a challenge around systems thinking, it's something that one needs to get one's head around, is how does one avoid getting such a complexity that one actually ends up paralyzed? And Patrick referred to IWRM, and I sometimes think that that's what we've done in IWRM. You've got to do it all of the time, and you end up unable, as a decision maker, to actually make a clear decision because you haven't got enough information about that, or there's that, or there's that, and you end up actually caught in a web of complexity that doesn't necessarily make for good and effective decision making. So one of the things for me that is critical in terms of systems thinking is being able to determine the boundaries that are necessary in order to answer the question or solve the problem that you are trying to solve. And those are boundaries that one has to determine. Patrick referred to district, local, national, transboundary. How far do you want to go? If you're trying to solve a problem, if you're trying to build the bicycle wheel, do you have to engage with the fact that this is part of a transboundary basin? So one needs to be able to set those boundaries for what is the problem that one is trying to address. And I think there's another thing that then becomes, it's not just a physical boundary, it's a boundary in terms of institutional, political, financial, social, etc. And part of that requires an ability to talk across disciplines. And I know we've been saying for decades that we need to talk across disciplines, and I think we've come a long way. But I still think that there are challenges in actually being able to talk across disciplines and talk the same language. And I'll give you an example for me of how the disciplines really see things very differently. At an Emmy research event a couple of years ago, a piece of work was presented by some social scientists who had been doing work on gender, understanding of gender and water. And they had done a piece of work in which they had, in a particular area, they had asked the men and they had separately asked the women about water sources available in the area. And the men and the women came up with different numbers of sources of water available because they had a different perspective on what a water source was and where they were and what was available. And for the social scientists, it was an issue around gender that needed to be understood. For the hydrologists in the room, the question was, yes, but how many water sources are there? And it was like they weren't talking, they weren't talking the same language. So assuming one can set the boundaries then clearly of a system so that it becomes something that you can actually grapple with and it's workable and it hasn't introduced sort of paralysis by analysis. There's then for me a question of what is the difference between system change and system transformation. And clearly we're all in this room because we know there's change needed. There's profound change needed. We need to move from wash systems that are not delivering the services that are required to wash systems that are working effectively, sustainably, and are delivering the services that people are due. Fundamentally, their human rights, but also at a much higher level. And so many of us, I think, have had the experience where you've worked in a particular area and you've put in a lot of effort, and you've put in a lot of effort, and you've put in a lot of effort, and then the project comes to an end, or somebody moves, and you step back and slides back into where it was previously, or sometimes even worse. So for me, there's a difference between system change and system transformation, and this is drawing on, to a certain extent, on resilience theory. Change, there's a tipping point in a system when a system changes into a different state. And the challenge is, how do we get past that tipping point so that we have changed the state of the system into something that is not going to slip back all the time, that it's actually now in a different and more effective state. And I don't know what those tipping points are, but I think if one's looking at a system, one has to look at how does one actually transform the system, not just get change that is possible to actually go backwards on. And then I think finally, I want to talk about the shadow system, or this very shadowy system that is an integral part of the WASH system everywhere in the world, to different degrees. In some areas, it is really just absolutely institutionalized into the system. In other ways, in other places, it's more peripheral, but I doubt that there is anywhere in the world that one can say that corruption, lack of integrity aren't part of the system. Corruption siphons off money. It prevents us bringing in the skills that we need. It siphons off water to sometimes the wrong people or different people. It's active, and it's very actively managed. I sometimes think if we could get the people who are so skillful at corruption and fraud to actually work on the side of the good, we would have far more efficient systems, because there's some very skillful and very innovative thinking that goes on in order to achieve corruption. And corruption and lack of integrity take a number of forms in the water sector. Bribery and collusion in big infrastructure projects. The construction industry is widely considered to be one of the most corrupt in the world. And the water sector, being what it is, has a lot of construction work that goes on, and there's a huge amount of corruption in that. It might be that where the personal business of an official actually runs counter to their public duty. In South Africa, we've had the situation where we have municipal officials who own water tankers. And so they don't really want the pipes to work, because they earn a lot more money when they're tankering water in, and there have been unproven statements around active sabotage of piped water systems in order to maintain the tankering process. It may be the manipulation of information, so that not everybody gets the same information, so that information is provided in a way to benefit certain groups and disbenefit others. It may be through the allocation of water to those who have power and money and access to resources, or for political ends, or for ethnic and religious purposes. It may be where people are forced to actually pay bribes or pay speed money, or for women to actually pay with their bodies in order to get access to the services that are their rights. And that is very widespread and very common. It may be around whether officials are taking the decisions to actually enforce the regulations around water quality, around licensing conditions, etc. It takes a number of forms. Whatever forms it takes, it is undermining our ability to reach the SDG, Goal 6. And Goal 6, as we know, underpins a whole lot of the other SDGs as well. There's a whole lot of the SDGs that are not achievable if we don't actually get water right. So the whole issue of corruption is something that we actually fundamentally need to address. And as I've said, it's present all over the place. Corruption is it's the classic iceberg. We see the tip of it. We see the stuff that comes out in one way or another in newspaper reports, occasionally in court cases, in stories from people on the ground. But because of its nature, and that's why I've called it the shadow system, a whole lot of it happens behind closed doors, wherever, that we're not seeing. So it's really difficult to actually get a handle on the extent of it and the full impact. But the estimations are that it costs us anywhere between 10% and up to 35–45% of the finances, and that's not talking about the other costs around health, around the indirect costs. The direct financial costs could be anywhere between 10 and 45–45%. If we're looking at between 770 billion, 1.7 billion, the figures are again quite wide, in terms of providing what we need to provide water services and sanitation over the next years. 10% of that is a huge amount of money. Now, I'm not imagining that we're ever going to live in a world in which corruption does not exist. But if we can live in a world in which corruption is substantially reduced, it frees up an enormous amount of money and resources for the delivery of services. And I don't want us to make the assumption that this is a developing country problem. This is a problem all over the world. PwC relatively recently did a study called Identifying and Reducing Corruption in Public Procurement in the EU, and it was not specific to water, but it did include water. And they found that 27% of the projects analysed contained kickbacks, 14% contained a conflict of interest. They found on average that the estimated probability of corruption is higher in water and waste compared to other sectors. And part of that is because water is a monopoly. Water is a sector that uses a lot of infrastructure, and there's a high level of discretion amongst officials in terms of making decisions. All of those enable it to be a very corrupt sector. So, and I've got very little time left, it is possible to address corruption and to improve integrity. It's an area that WIN works with a number of partners, and there are a number of things that one can look at. This is the integrity wall, and we look at 4 elements of it: transparency, accountability, participation, and direct anti-corruption activities. And there is a session, at some stage, this is the commercial break, there is a session on the program where this will be addressed. And we have seen various places in which there have been changes where people have actually consciously taken on the issue of corruption and lack of integrity. In terms of transparency, for example, the Kenyan Water Services Trust Fund created something called Maji Data, which is an online, easily accessible data source which contains information of where all projects are that they have funded. And that's important because the location of projects, sometimes the projects aren't where they're allegedly located. Sometimes the location has been very influenced by political or other interests. And so simply providing that information to people actually enables them to raise questions around delivery. The Guma Valley Water Company in Sierra Leone, in fact, grappled with the issue of corruption, and they took control of their billing system. because there'd been a system for years in which officials had negotiated with people about how much they had to pay relative to how much came through the back door. And so by taking the billing system and by analyzing water consumption over the previous many years, they actually worked out how much people should be being charged. And then they put in place a system that actually, an electronic system that actually ensured that happened and reduced the ability of officials to actually be exercising their discretion in terms of how much people were paying. So there are a number of ways of actually addressing the issue of corruption. And those, as I say, are the 4 elements that we focus on: transparency, accountability, participation, and anti-corruption. And I just want to mention here one of the things that I find very interesting in terms of participation and who gets involved. And that is the stuff that is coming out of research, that a more diverse group, both in terms of gender but other forms of diversity, in boards and in management, reduces corruption. The jury's out on whether it's because women are inherently less corrupt than men. There are some who argue they were, but the jury is out on that one. But what it does do is it breaks the group think. You have people who come to the table with different interests and different approaches, and it becomes less easy to have the group think that enables profound corruption to grow. So if I can, there we go. On that note, I'm going to end now. My time has run out as well. I'm really looking forward to the discussions over the next 3 days, and hope that I'm going to learn as much from you as possible in that period. And I do hope that the issue of corruption and integrity will be part of the discussion around the systems over the next period of time, and as you all go back to wherever you came from, and take it into the work, because I think it is an absolutely critical issue that we have to deal with. So thank you very much.